Hey guys, so we're still looking at comparing decimals this week. Today we're going to look at comparing tenths and hundredths. So we have some different places to look at. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first problem we're going to look at says Matt measures two insects. The bumblebee is 0.75 of an inch long. The hornet is 0.8 of an inch long. Which insect is longer? So we're comparing 0.75 here and 0.8. So I want you to try it on your own first and see what you can figure out, and then we'll come back together and work it out. Okay, so I know what I need to do is I'm going to use my place value chart here, okay, like we've been doing. Let me fix that. It needs to be a little bit thicker. Okay, that's better. So I'm going to label it. Okay, all right. So there we go. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to put our two decimals in the correct spot. So we have 0.75 and 0.8. Okay, so it wants to know which insect is longer. So we're going to do the same thing we did, except now, since we have one number that has hundredths and one number that doesn't, we're going to add a 0 right there, just so they have the same amount of decimals after the decimal point, okay? Same amount of places. So we start, we look at our ones place. I know that I can't compare those. 0 and 0 are equal to each other. So then I'm going to move over and I'm going to look at my tenths place, okay? So I'm looking at 7 and 8. Well, I know that 8 is greater than 7, okay, when I'm talking about just the regular number. So since I know that already, I can already go ahead and say that 0.8 is greater than 0.75, okay? So I know that the hornet that Matt measured was longer than the bumblebee that he measured, because remember, this was the hornet and this was the bee. Okay, so I know that the hornet measured longer. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go to the next page and let's look at some more ways that we can solve this. Okay, so we have our base 10 blocks that we're used to seeing and we're used to looking at. So we're still looking at the same numbers. Okay, so this one, this is our 0.75 and this is our 0.8. So remember, if you have one place after your decimal, that's tenths, okay? If you have two places, that's hundredths, okay? So that tells you which base 10 block you need to use on each one, okay? So if we look at 0.75, we can see that 75 of these are shaded in, okay? So there's 75 of those. And then there are 8 columns in this one that are shaded in, okay? Now, so just by looking at those two things, I can tell that 0.8 here has more shaded than 0.75. So that means that that insect would be longer, okay? So let's go on down. Again, let's look at place value chart, which we just looked at, okay? We just did. So this one is the same thing that I just talked about. You compare your first digits that are not the same, and you try to figure out which one's bigger or smaller, depending on what your question says. Of course, this one was bigger. So again, I look, 8 is bigger than 7, okay? So that means that 0.8 was greater than 0.75, okay? So let's keep going. We're on a roll. Let's keep going. So let's look at our connect questions. So number 1 says write equivalent fractions to 0.75 and 0.8. So remember, the word equivalent means equal. So I'm going to write equal. Whoops, I got to get my pen going here. Equivalent is equal. Okay, that way you don't get confused. So write equivalent fractions. So we just talked about if you have one place after your decimal, that's tenths, and if you have two places, that's hundredths. So if we're looking at our 0.75 first, okay, I have 2 places, so that tells me that my denominator is going to be 100, and my numerator is 75, okay? So if I go to 0.8, I have one place, so that tells me my denominator is a 10, and then everything after my decimal is my numerator, so I have 8/10, okay? Number 2, how can you compare fractions with denominators of 110? So I have my fractions here, 75 over 100 and 8 over 10. If you remember correctly, last week before last, we talked about changing tenths to hundredths, and all we had to do to get this to be 100 was add a 0 to the bottom and add a 0 to the top. So now I have 80 100ths, which is still bigger than 75 hundredths, okay? So what fraction with a denominator of 100 is equal to 8/10? We just figured that out to be 80 100ths, okay? And compare the fractions, then compare 0.75 and 0.8 using greater than, less than, or equal to. So if we're going to compare our fractions, 75 over 100 is less than 80 over 100, okay? And 0.75 is less than 0.8, okay? So if your fraction is bigger, then your decimal equivalent is going to be bigger, okay? That's just the rule, okay? So let's go on down. So explain how you compare decimals when one is in tenths and the other is in hundredths. So you would, in order to do that, let me fix this here, okay? We'll just move this down. So explain how to do that. So if you have one in tenths and one in hundredths, so all you would do is add a 0 to your hundredths place for your tenths decimal, okay? So if it's missing a spot, you just fill it in with a 0, okay? That's just typical rule, okay? So if you line them up in your place value chart and one doesn't have enough spaces, fill it in with zeros, okay? So whoops, I moved my stuff out of the way. All right, so number 6 here, I just want you to think about the two ways that we looked at to solve this. So we looked at base 10 blocks, and we looked at place value chart, and then we've looked at fractions. You can change them to fractions. So you have lots of different options to be able to solve these. And I want you to use the one that's best for you, the one that works the best for you, okay? So let's go on. Let's do some example problems here. So let's look at number 7. So number 7 says, which is greater, 0.9 or 0.92? Show how you can use fractions to solve the problem. Show your work. Okay, so they want us to use fractions in this one, okay? So we're going to use, so we have 0.9, okay? And then we have 0.92, okay? So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and add a 0 here. That way I have the same amount of decimals after my numbers after my decimal place. So I know here I have 2 numbers after my decimal. That means my denominator on both of these is going to be 100, okay? And everything after my decimal is my numerator. So that one would be 90, and that one would be 92. Now I'd ask you which is greater. So which is greater, 90 or 92? Well, I know just from counting that 92 is greater. So I could write that 90 over 100 is less than 92 over 100. I can also write 0.9 is less than 0.92. Okay? All right. So let's keep going. Let's look at number 8. The locations of points B and C on the number line represent decimal numbers. Explain why the value of point C is greater than the value of point B. Okay, so you see here, here's B. B is 0.66. C is 0.7. Okay, so what I want you to do really quick is think about your answer here. Think about why the value of C is greater than B. Okay, and write your answer down, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so let's look at this. So if you know anything about a number line, you know that this end is less than this end, and this end is usually greater. So if your explanation was that 0.66 is farther left than 0.7, that's one way to explain it. You can also use your place value chart here to explain it, okay? Okay, so I have ones, tenths and hundredths here. So if I put those in my place value chart, so I have 0.66 and 0.7, and so remember I have an extra spot, so I need to put a 0 there. So I can look here at my tenths place. Okay, I know that 7 is greater than 6, so that means that 0.7 is greater than 0.66. Okay, so you have lots of options here on ways to answer these questions. So let's look down here at number 9. Compare 0.37 and 0.4 using greater than, less than, or equal to. Explain how you got your answer and show your work. So I want you to try this one on your own. Okay, any of the ways that we've just talked about solving it, you can do that. And then once you're finished, we'll come back and we'll do it together. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this. So I went ahead and drew my place value chart because that's the easiest way for me to see if things are equal or not. So I'm going to write in my 0.37, and then I have 0.4. I have a blank spot, so I'm going to fill that in with a 0. So I know that my ones place are equal to each other, so I need to move over to my tenths place. Well, I have a 4 and a 3. I know that 4 is greater than 3. So that means that 0.4 is greater than 0.37. Okay? You could have done it different ways. You could have done base 10 blocks and colored in the appropriate number of spaces. You could have done that. You could have used fractions. So you had lots of different options here. Okay? So let's look at your homework, okay? Your classwork pages. So on your classwork, you have an example at the top, okay? So you have an example, and it's talking about, it uses fractions, okay, which we just talked about. So if you look at number 1, so number 1, 2, and 3 are all using that problem above number 1, okay? So on number 1, all you're doing is shading your models to represent those 2 decimals. Number 2, you're filling in your symbol for which one would be appropriate to make that statement true. And then on number 3, you're saying if Lucas bought more fish or more shrimp, and you're giving me the equivalent fractions to explain your answer. Okay, on number 4, you're comparing 0.2 and 0.25, and you're also using fractions to explain. Number 5, you're using your place value chart, okay, to solve your answer, and then you'll use your greater than, less than, or equal to symbols. Number 6, you're doing the same thing, except you have 3 decimals this time, and it wants to know a couple things. First, it wants to know which one is the greatest of all 3, and then it wants to know which one is the least, and you have to do equivalent fractions. So there's several things on that one that you have to do in order to get full credit on that one. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow.